a millionaire found a woman crying at her son's grave. What she told him shattered his heart. Snow fell silently over St. Mary's Cemetery that December afternoon. Among the weathered headstones, Daniel Richardson stood motionless, his expensive coat collecting snowflakes like memories he couldn't shake. At 63, the former hospital CEO had everything money could buy, yet he came here weakly, drawn by a guilt heavier than the granite markers surrounding him. A sound caught his attention, soft sobs carried on the winter wind. Through the gentle curtain of snow, he noticed a woman kneeling before a small grave, her shoulders shaking with grief. Her clothes were worn, her coat patched in places, but there was a dignity in her posture that made him pause. He should have walked away. That's what he'd done for years, turning his back on others' pain, building walls around his heart, with each bonus check and board meeting. But something about her reminded him of Sarah, his late wife, in those final days when the hospital board had denied her experimental treatment. As he drew closer, his eyes caught the dates on the modest headstone. Leo Thompson, forever 7 years old, the fresh flowers laid against the snow spoke of a love that refused to fade. The woman must have sensed his presence, for she turned, revealing eyes that held both defiance and despair. "I'm Claire," she whispered, her voice rough with tears. "And this is my boy." She touched a small notebook partially hidden among the flowers, a child's diary, its pages wrinkled from what appeared to be frequent reading. Daniel couldn't know then that this moment, this simple interaction in the snow, would unravel everything he'd built his life upon. He couldn't know that the diary beside Leo's grave held secrets that would shake the very foundation of St. Mary's Hospital, or that the woman before him would help him rediscover his soul. All he knew was that for the first time in 15 years, the walls around his heart began to crack. Hey, beautiful souls, where are you watching this from? Take a moment to drop your location in the comments and hit that like button. Let's connect through this story together. Daniel Richardson hadn't always been the cold, calculating figure that stalked the halls of St. Mary's Hospital. 30 years ago, he was a bright-eyed medical student who believed in healing above profit. His colleagues remembered him as the resident who worked extra shifts, who sat with terminal patients through lonely nights, who fought insurance companies for his patients' rights. The transformation began slowly, like a cancer eating away at his idealism. First came his appointment as department head, then the realization that medicine was as much about numbers as it was about healing. Each budget meeting chipped away at his soul. Each denied treatment request hardened his heart, until the day he found himself arguing against providing care to those who couldn't pay. His wife Sarah had been his moral compass, a pediatric nurse who never lost her compassion. She would come home with stories of the children she'd helped, the families she'd comforted. Even as Daniel climbed the corporate ladder, she remained grounded, often challenging his increasingly profit-driven decisions. "The day we stop seeing patients as people," she would say, "is the day we stop being healers." But Sarah's voice was silenced too soon. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. The hospital CEO's wife, dying in her own institution, denied the very treatment she had fought for others to receive. The board deemed it experimental, cost prohibitive, despite Daniel's wealth and influence. He watched helplessly as bureaucracy and policy, the very system he had helped build, claimed the love of his life. After Sarah's death, Daniel retreated into himself. He sold their family home, moved into a sterile penthouse overlooking the city, and threw himself into making St. Mary's the most profitable hospital in the state. His reputation grew. The Ice King of healthcare, they called him. He wore the title like armor, using efficiency metrics and cost analyses to justify turning away those who couldn't pay. The hospital board loved him. Under his leadership, St. Mary's profit margins soared. New wings were built, cutting-edge equipment was purchased, wealthy donors flocked to charity galas. But in the quiet moments when he walked the hospital corridors late at night, he sometimes caught glimpses of his younger self in the tired faces of idealistic residents. He saw Sarah's ghost in the nurses who fought for their patients, and each time he turned away. His daily routine became a fortress: early mornings reviewing financial reports, afternoons in board meetings, evenings alone in his office overlooking the city. He donated to charities carefully selected, tax-deductible contributions that earned him recognition without requiring emotional investment. His name appeared on hospital wings and medical research grants, but he never attended the dedications. The only break in his routine was his weekly visit to Sarah's grave. Even there, he maintained his distance, arriving at dawn when the cemetery was empty, leaving before others arrived. He spoke to no one, acknowledged no one, until that snowy December day when he heard Claire Thompson's sobs. Those who worked closely with Daniel noticed subtle changes in the weeks leading up to that fateful meeting. He had become more withdrawn, spending hours staring out his office window at the hospital's charity wing, the wing that turned away more patients than it helped. He had begun questioning the board's decisions, though not openly opposing them. It was as if something was stirring beneath the frozen surface of his carefully constructed world. Few knew about the nightmares that plagued him, dreams where Sarah asked why he had betrayed everything they once believed in. Fewer still knew about the files he kept locked in his private safe, documentation of questionable board decisions, of diverted charity funds, of patients denied care while board members' relatives received preferential treatment. But nobody knew his deepest secret, that every night he read through Sarah's old journals, touching her words like wounds that refused to heal. In her final entry she had written, "Love isn't measured in profit margins, my darling. One day you'll remember that." As he stood in the cemetery that December afternoon, watching Claire Thompson's grief, Sarah's words echoed in his mind for the first time in years. Daniel Richardson was a man at the crossroads, though he didn't know it yet. His carefully constructed world of profit and loss, of emotional distance and corporate success, was about to collide with a force more powerful than any boardroom strategy: the raw, honest grief of a woman who had lost everything but refused to lose her humanity. Claire Thompson never meant to become a mother. At 35, she had built her life around her career as a pediatric nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, finding fulfillment in the small moments of healing she witnessed daily. That changed the night her younger sister Amanda, also a nurse at St. Mary's, collapsed during a double shift in the pediatric ward. The diagnosis was brutal, an undetected heart condition exacerbated by overwork and stress. Amanda left behind a 3-year-old son, Leo, and a handwritten will naming Claire as his guardian. The transition from aunt to mother happened overnight. Claire learned to balance midnight feedings with morning shifts, to soothe nightmares while battling her own grief, to explain to a toddler why Mummy wasn't coming home. She moved from her comfortable downtown apartment to a smaller one near Leo's preschool, cutting expenses wherever possible to maintain his routine. Her savings dwindled, but Leo's smile made every sacrifice worthwhile. At St. Mary's, Claire's position as a nurse became increasingly precarious. The new administration, led by Daniel Richardson, implemented stringent efficiency measures. Senior nurses were replaced with cheaper, less experienced staff. Claire watched in horror as patient care deteriorated while profit margins soared. When she spoke up at staff meetings, her concerns were dismissed. When she documented incidents of negligence, her reports mysteriously disappeared. The final blow came during a particularly harsh winter. Budget cuts led to understaffing, and Claire found herself working increasingly dangerous hours, just as her sister had. During one exhausting shift, she made a minor medication documentation error, no harm done, but it was enough. The administration used it as grounds for demotion. Overnight, she went from senior nurse to hospital janitor, her salary cut in half. But pride kept her from quitting. She needed the health insurance for Leo, and the familiar hospital halls held memories of Amanda she couldn't bear to leave. So she adapted, cleaning floors she once walked as a healthcare provider, emptying trash bins in offices where she once attended staff meetings. Some former colleagues avoided eye contact, embarrassed by her fall from grace. Others, particularly the newer nurses, sought her advice in whispered conversations during her night shifts. Then came Leo's diagnosis. Leukemia, the word fell like a hammer in the sterile consultation room. Claire knew enough about medicine to understand the gravity, to recognize the signs she had dismissed as ordinary childhood fatigue. She also knew with crushing certainty that her janitor's salary and basic insurance wouldn't cover the treatment he needed. The irony wasn't lost on her cleaning the very hospital where her son needed treatment, watching wealthy patients receive care while Leo grew weaker. She applied for every assistance program, filled out countless charity care applications, picked up extra shifts until she was working nearly 18 hours a day. Her neighbors in the apartment complex took turns watching Leo, a community of working-class families supporting one of their own. What few knew was that Claire kept detailed records of every denied application, every overheard conversation about fund allocation, every instance of preferential treatment she witnessed during her late-night cleaning shifts. She documented it all in a worn notebook, just as her sister Amanda had taught her to document patient care. "Everything leaves a paper trail," Amanda used to say. "The truth always finds its way out." Leo became her partner in this careful documentation. From his hospital bed he kept his own diary, filling it with observations only a child could make, which nurses were kind, which doctors seemed sad, which hospital administrators never looked patients in the eye. He drew pictures of the hospital as he imagined it could be, with gardens and playgrounds and doctors who had time to listen. The breaking point came when Claire discovered that the hospital's charitable foundation, which had denied Leo's application, had funded a board member's spouse's elective surgery. That night she stood in Leo's hospital room, watching him sleep, and made a decision. She would fight not just for Leo, but for every patient who had been denied care while the wealthy received preferential treatment. She couldn't know then that her path would cross with Daniel Richardson's, or that Leo's innocent observations would become crucial evidence in exposing the hospital's corruption. All she knew was that she had nothing left to lose, and that sometimes, as Amanda had taught her, the most important battle wasn't for life itself, but for the principle that every life held equal value. In the quiet hospital night, cleaning floors and keeping watch over her son, Claire Thompson prepared for war. Leo Thompson was unlike any 7-year-old the staff at St. Mary's Hospital had encountered. While other children his age fought against hospital routines, Leo embraced them with a peculiar grace. He memorized the nurses' schedules, learned the doctors' habits, and kept track of hospital patterns with an attention to detail that both charmed and unsettled the adults around him. Born with his mother Amanda's observant eyes and his Aunt Claire's gentle spirit, Leo had always been precocious. He learned to read at 4, devoured books about medicine and healing, and dreamed of becoming a doctor like the ones who help people smile again. After his mother's death, he developed a habit of watching people really watching them, in a way that made some adults uncomfortable. He could tell when a nurse had been crying in the break room, or when a doctor was worried about a patient. His small blue diary, a gift from Claire on his 6th birthday, became his constant companion. In it, he recorded everything he saw with childlike honesty. Dr. Peterson looks sad today. He told Mrs. Johnson he couldn't help her because she didn't have enough money. But last week he helped Mr. Richman right away. I don't understand. His observations, written in careful primary school handwriting, painted a picture of hospital life that no adult would have thought to document. When his own diagnosis came, Leo approached it with the same curious detachment. He asked the doctors detailed questions about his leukemia, took notes about his treatment options, and comforted Claire when she thought he wasn't looking. "Don't worry, Aunt Claire," he would say. "I'm collecting evidence like Mom used to do. Something isn't right here, but we'll figure it out." From his hospital bed, Leo had a unique vantage point. He noticed how the care differed between private and shared rooms, how some patients were rushed to treatment while others waited endlessly, how whispered conversations in corridors often preceded bad news. He drew pictures of everything: the tired nurses, the worried families, the administrators in expensive suits who never made eye contact. His diary entries became more focused as his condition worsened. Today they moved Emily from the room next door. Her mum was crying because they couldn't pay. But I saw them give her room to someone who just arrived. The new patient's dad plays golf with Dr. Richardson. I heard the nurses talking about it. Each observation was accompanied by a child's drawing, capturing details that would have escaped adult notice. What made Leo extraordinary wasn't just his insight, but his capacity for empathy. He shared his toys with other sick children, told stories to distract worried parents, and always had a smile for the cleaning staff, especially since Claire had joined their ranks. He kept track of birthdays, remembered favorite colors, and somehow knew exactly when someone needed a hug or a kind word. But Leo harbored a secret that even Claire didn't know. Late at night, when the hospital was quiet except for the beeping of monitors, he wrote letters, dozens of them. Letters to the children who had been turned away, to the nurses who cried in supply closets, to the doctors who seemed to have forgotten why they became healers, and most importantly, letters to Mr. Richardson, the man Leo had never met, but whose decisions affected everyone in the hospital. "Dear Mr. Richardson," one letter began, "I know you must be very sad. Only very sad people forget how to help others. My mom used to say that hospitals are where hope lives, but there isn't much hope here anymore. Maybe we could fix that together." As his condition deteriorated, Leo's writings became more urgent, more purposeful. He knew something that the adults around him had forgotten, that sometimes the greatest acts of healing had nothing to do with medicine. His diary filled with plans for a different kind of hospital, one where money didn't determine who lived or died, where doctors remembered to hold patients' hands, where hope wasn't a luxury reserved for the wealthy. What no one realized was that Leo's seemingly random observations and innocent questions were slowly building a case that would eventually shake St. Mary's to its foundations. His child's eye view of systemic corruption, documented with crayon drawings and misspelled words, would prove more damning than any official investigation. In his final entry, written in shaky handwriting during a fever night, Leo wrote, "Sometimes grown-ups forget what's important because they're too busy being grown up. But I haven't forgotten, and I'm keeping track of everything, Mum, just like you taught Aunt Claire to do. Maybe someday someone will remember what hospitals are supposed to be about." He couldn't know then that his words would eventually reach Daniel Richardson, or that his simple observations would become the catalyst for change. He was just a 7-year-old boy with a diary, bearing witness to a broken system with the uncompromising honesty of a child. The day Leo's diagnosis came was deceptively bright, sunlight streaming through the hospital windows like mockery. Claire had brought him in after weeks of unexplained bruising and fatigue, her nurse's instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. The pediatric oncologist, Dr. Sarah Matthews, delivered the news with gentle professionalism: acute lymphoblastic leukemia, aggressive but treatable if they could begin immediately. The words hit Claire like physical blows. "The survival rate with immediate treatment is promising," Dr. Matthews explained, her eyes conveying what her professional demeanor couldn't. That every day of delay reduced those chances. She handed Claire a folder containing treatment protocols, medical documentation, and most dauntingly, cost estimates. The numbers blurred before Claire's eyes: $450,000 for the initial phase alone. St. Mary's policy required a substantial down payment before beginning treatment. Claire's insurance, the basic plan offered to hospital custodial staff, would cover only a fraction of the costs. Dr. Matthews, who remembered Claire from her nursing days, tried to be hopeful. "There are financial assistance programs," she said. "I'll help you apply for everything available." But the system moved slowly, while Leo's condition deteriorated rapidly. Each day brought new symptoms: nosebleeds that wouldn't stop, fever spikes that left him shaking, bruises blooming across his pale skin like dark flowers. Claire watched other children begin their treatments while she battled paperwork and bureaucracy. In the oncology ward, she cleaned floors around beds occupied by children whose parents had platinum insurance or private wealth. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone a hospital employee's child, denied the very care his mother had once provided to others. Some nurses slipped Claire extra supplies, pain medication, anything they could manage without raising flags. Dr. Matthews scheduled consultations that were really treatment sessions in disguise, but she could only do so much within the system's constraints. Leo, ever observant, documented everything in his diary. "The lady in accounting looks sad when she tells Aunt Claire no," he wrote. "Maybe she remembers when Mum used to bring her coffee during night shifts." He drew pictures of the other children starting treatment, of Claire filling out forms late into the night, of Dr. Matthews arguing with hospital administrators on their behalf. The breaking point came 3 weeks after diagnosis. Claire stood before the hospital's financial assistance board, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. She had pawned everything of value, worked double shifts, even set up a crowdfunding page that had raised a fraction of what they needed. "My sister, his mother, died serving this hospital," she reminded them. "Surely that counts for something." The board members avoided her eyes. Daniel Richardson, attending remotely via video conference, cleared his throat. "While we sympathize with your situation, Ms. Thompson, we must maintain consistent policies. The Charitable Care Fund is currently allocated to other cases." What he didn't mention was that those other cases included the hospital board chairman's niece's cosmetic surgery. That evening, as Claire changed Leo's sweat-soaked sheets, he grabbed her hand with surprising strength. "It's okay, Aunt Claire," he whispered. "Mom always said the truth finds its way out." She couldn't know then that Leo had been secretly recording his conversations with doctors, nurses and administrators in his diary, building a record that would later prove invaluable. Dr. Matthews made one last attempt, approaching Daniel Richardson directly. "This child will die without treatment," she stated bluntly. "Is that really the legacy you want for St. Mary's?" His response was corporate and cold. "Doctor, if we make exceptions based on emotional appeals, we compromise the entire system." The system, as it turned out, was already compromised beyond measure. But it would take Leo's worsening condition, Claire's desperate measures, and an unlikely alliance to expose just how deep the corruption ran. For now, Claire could only hold her nephew through another fever night, wondering how a place dedicated to healing could become so sick at its core. The meeting that would forever change St. Mary's Hospital took place in Daniel Richardson's penthouse office on the 15th floor. Claire Thompson stood before his imposing desk, her janitor's uniform exchanged for her only decent outfit, clutching a folder of medical documents and financial records. She had secured this meeting through sheer persistence, camping outside his office for 3 days until his secretary finally relented. Daniel barely looked up from his computer as Claire presented Leo's case. Her voice, steady despite her exhaustion, outlined the medical necessity, the time-sensitive nature of the treatment, their desperate financial situation. She spoke of her sister Amanda's dedication to St. Mary's, of Leo's extraordinary spirit, of the community's efforts to raise funds. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the office as she pleaded for what should have been a basic human right, the chance to save her child. "Ms. Thompson." Daniel interrupted, his voice carrying the practiced patience of someone accustomed to delivering bad news. "While your situation is unfortunate, St. Mary's must maintain strict financial protocols. Our charitable funds are allocated based on objective criteria, not emotional appeals." He slid her application back across the desk, his wedding ring catching the light, a detail Leo would later mention in his diary. What Daniel didn't reveal was the memo sitting in his inbox from the hospital board chairman, Thomas Wells. The charitable fund, supposedly depleted, had just approved a significant sum for experimental treatment for Wells's daughter. The same fund that couldn't spare a fraction of that amount for a dying child was being used as a private resource for the hospital's elite. Claire recognized the dismissal in his tone, but desperation made her bold. "Mr. Richardson," she said, pulling out her final piece of evidence, a documented pattern of discriminatory care practices she'd gathered during her night shifts. "This isn't just about Leo. There's something fundamentally wrong with how this hospital allocates resources. For a moment, something flickered in Daniel's eyes, recognition perhaps, or guilt, but it vanished quickly behind his professional mask. "Ms. Thompson, if you're suggesting impropriety, I should remind you that as a hospital employee, you're bound by certain confidentiality agreements. Your position here could be jeopardized by unfounded accusations." The threat was clear, but Claire stood her ground. "My sister died serving this hospital," she said quietly. She believed in what St. Mary's was supposed to stand for. What happened to healing first? She placed Leo's latest test results on his desk, results showing the rapid progression of his disease. Daniel's response was corporate and rehearsed. "I understand this is difficult, but we must maintain professional boundaries. The board's decision is final." He pressed a button, summoning security to escort her out. As they led her away, she noticed the photographs on his wall, younger versions of himself with his late wife Sarah, both wearing doctors' coats, both smiling with the idealism of new healers. That evening, the hospital board received an anonymous email containing detailed documentation of financial discrepancies in the charitable care fund. The source was untraceable, but the information was damning. Board members exchanged worried calls while Daniel sat in his office, staring at the photo of Sarah, remembering her last words about the system they'd helped build. Claire returned to Leo's room to find him drawing elaborate pictures of the hospital as he imagined it could be, with gardens where children could heal and doors open to everyone who needed help. "Mr. Richardson looked sad," Leo observed, adding details to his drawing. Maybe he forgot how to listen to his heart. Neither Claire nor Daniel could have known then that this rejection would set in motion a chain of events that would expose decades of corruption. That Leo's innocent observations, combined with Claire's evidence and Daniel's buried conscience, would eventually force St. Mary's to confront its betrayal of its founding principles. For now, though, Claire held her nephew through another pain-filled night, while somewhere above them, Daniel Richardson began his own sleepless vigil, haunted by decisions he couldn't quite justify anymore. The morning Leo collapsed in the hospital cafeteria became the catalyst that shattered St. Mary's carefully maintained facade. Claire had brought him for routine blood work, trying to maintain normalcy by letting him have his favorite hospital pudding. One moment he was smiling, telling her about his latest diary entry. The next, he was unconscious, blood streaming from his nose, his small body convulsing on the sterile floor. The response was immediate but complicated by bureaucracy. Dr. Matthews rushed to help, but the emergency protocol required insurance verification before intensive care admission. While nurses worked frantically to stabilize Leo, administrators huddled nearby, discussing payment protocols in hushed voices. Claire, still in her janitor's uniform from the night shift, screamed at them to help her son. The scene drew attention from patients, visitors, and staff. Among them was Rebecca Wells, the board chairman's daughter, fresh from her charity-funded experimental treatment. She filmed the entire incident on her phone, capturing the stark contrast between her own care and Leo's situation. The video would later become crucial evidence, though she didn't know it then. In the chaos, Claire made a desperate decision. She grabbed Leo's diary from his backpack and began reading aloud, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent cafeteria. The words of a dying child, documenting months of observed injustice, echoed off the walls descriptions of denied treatments, of whispered deals, of suffering families turned away while others received immediate care. Hospital security moved to stop her, but something remarkable happened. Staff members, nurses, orderlies, even some doctors formed a circle around Claire and Leo. Dr. Matthews, her career potentially on the line, stepped forward. "This child needs immediate treatment," she announced, "and I'm providing it with or without administrative approval." The standoff made its way to Daniel Richardson's office in real time. Watching through the security feeds, he saw his hospital's ugly truth laid bare. In Leo's stretcher, he saw Sarah in her final days. In Claire's desperate voice, he heard echoes of his own pleas for his wife's treatment. The carefully constructed walls between his past idealism and present corruption began to crumble. Word spread quickly through the hospital. Staff members began coming forward with their own stories and evidence. The cafeteria incident became a symbol of everything wrong with the system. Local news vans gathered outside, drawn by calls from concerned citizens. Social media exploded with Rebecca Wells's video, hashtags demanding justice for Leo trending within hours. By evening, St. Mary's was in crisis. The board demanded Leo's removal, citing policy violations, but the staff refused to move him from the ICU, where Dr. Matthews had admitted him. Claire, running on exhaustion and determination, continued reading from Leo's diary to the growing crowd of supporters. In his office, Daniel Richardson faced a choice that would define not just his career but his humanity. The board was pressuring him to end the situation, to protect their interests. But Sarah's voice in his head was louder. The day we stop seeing patients as people is the day we stop being healers. Leo, briefly conscious in the ICU, made one last entry in his diary. Sometimes it takes a storm to clear the air. Maybe now they'll remember what hospitals are for. His words, innocent yet profound, would soon reach far beyond the walls of St. Mary's, touching hearts and challenging consciences in ways no one could have predicted. The breaking point had arrived, and with it, the first cracks in a system that had prioritized profit over people for far too long. St. Mary's would never be the same, but first, there would be a price to pay for change. I pour my heart into crafting these stories for you. If they touch your soul, consider subscribing to join our storytelling family. Together, we can create more meaningful moments and share more powerful tales that remind us of our humanity. The manila envelope arrived on Daniel Richardson's desk anonymously, its contents threatening to unravel 15 years of carefully guarded secrets at St. Mary's Hospital. Inside were hundreds of pages of documented evidence, financial records showing systematic misuse of charitable funds, emails discussing preferential treatment for board members' families, and most damning of all, a detailed record of patients who had died after being denied care they could have received. Among the documents was a familiar name that made Daniel's blood run cold: Sarah Richardson. His wife's medical records were there, annotated with notes revealing that her experimental treatment had been denied not because it was too risky, as he'd been told, but because the funds had been diverted to a board member's personal project. The truth he'd buried beneath years of corporate loyalty and moral compromise stared back at him in black and white. The evidence had been meticulously compiled, each incident cross-referenced and dated. Some bore the unmistakable mark of Claire Thompson's nursing background, detailed medical observations, and precise documentation. Others came from sources throughout the hospital: nurses, orderlies, even cleaning staff who had witnessed conversations they weren't meant to hear. But the most powerful evidence came from an unexpected source: Leo's diary. The child's simple, honest observations painted a devastating picture. Today they told Mrs. Rodriguez she couldn't have her medicine because she didn't have enough money, one entry read. But right after, Mr. Wells's daughter got special treatment because he's important. Mom always said hospitals were supposed to help everyone the same, the truth, seen through a child's eyes, stripped away every corporate justification. As Daniel read through the evidence, memories he'd suppressed for years began to surface. He remembered the early days of his career, when he and Sarah had dreamed of making St. Mary's a beacon of hope for all patients. He recalled the gradual compromises, the small decisions that had seemed necessary at the time, each one leading him further from his original purpose as a healer. The documentation revealed a pattern more systematic than even he had realized. The hospital's charitable foundation, meant to help those in need, had become a private funding source for the board's pet projects and personal medical expenses. Meanwhile, patients like Leo were denied basic, life-saving treatments. The numbers were staggering: millions diverted, hundreds of lives affected. dozens lost unnecessarily. What hit Daniel hardest were the parallel stories of Sarah and Amanda Thompson, Leo's mother. Both had died serving the hospital, both victims of a system that prioritized profit over care. The records showed that Amanda's fatal heart condition might have been detected earlier if the staff health screening program hadn't been cut to save costs, a decision he had personally approved. The final document in the package was a letter from Sarah, dated just before her death, that had somehow been kept from him. In it, she wrote of her disappointment in what St. Mary's had become, but also of her belief that Daniel would someday remember his calling as a healer. "The system isn't broken," she had written. "It's been corrupted, and you have the power to fix it." As Daniel sat in his office that night, the weight of truth crushing his carefully constructed worldview, he heard commotion from the oncology ward. Leo had taken a turn for the worse, his condition deteriorating rapidly without the treatment he'd been denied. Through the security feeds, Daniel watched Claire holding her nephew, singing softly as his fever raged, while outside the room, Dr. Matthews fought with administrators over emergency protocols. The parallel was unbearable, another family facing loss because of a system he had helped create. But this time he had a choice. The evidence in his hands could bring down the entire board, expose years of corruption, and possibly save lives. It could also end his career and potentially lead to criminal charges for those involved, including himself. In the growing darkness of his office, Daniel pulled out an old photograph of himself and Sarah in their residency days. Their young faces smiled back at him, full of idealism and purpose. Beside it, he placed Leo's latest diary entry, somehow included in the package. "I think Mr. Richardson has forgotten what it feels like to help people. Maybe he just needs someone to remind him." The truth had emerged, stark and undeniable. The question now was what he would do with it. As night fell over St. Mary's, Daniel Richardson began to type an email that would either salvage his soul or destroy everything he had built. The price of redemption would be high, but for the first time in 15 years, he was ready to pay it. For 3 days after receiving the evidence, Daniel Richardson waged a war within himself. By day, he maintained his corporate facade, attending board meetings and signing documents with practiced efficiency. By night, he pored over the damning evidence, each page adding weight to his conscience. The security feeds from Leo's room played constantly on his office monitor, a silent reminder of the human cost of his decisions. In those sleepless nights, Sarah's voice became increasingly clear in his memory. He remembered their last conversation when she had begged him to fight the system he'd helped create. "The hospital is sick, Daniel," she had said, "and you're treating the symptoms while ignoring the disease." He had dismissed her words then, attributing them to medication and fatigue. Now, with evidence of corruption spread across his desk, her wisdom haunted him. Claire Thompson, meanwhile, fought her own battles in the oncology ward. Despite exhaustion and despair, she continued documenting everything, every denied treatment, every preferential admission, every whispered conversation about fund allocation. She worked her night shifts as a janitor, then spent days by Leo's bedside, building a case that was becoming impossible to ignore. The hospital staff found themselves caught in the growing tension. Nurses delayed paperwork to buy time for critical patients. Doctors like Sarah Matthews bent rules to provide care, knowing their careers hung in the balance. Even the administrative staff began quietly leaking documents, their consciences finally outweighing their fear of retribution. Leo's condition became a mirror reflecting the hospital's moral crisis. His fever spiked and fell like the hospital's ethical standards. His breathing grew labored, much like the strained atmosphere in board meetings. Yet he continued writing in his diary, his observations becoming more profound as his body weakened. "The grown-ups here are scared," he wrote. "They know what's right, but they're afraid to do it. Mom said being brave isn't about not being scared, it's about doing the right thing anyway." The turning point came during a midnight board meeting called to discuss risk management. Thomas Wells, the board chairman, proposed transferring Leo to a public hospital, a death sentence given his critical condition. As Daniel listened to the clinical discussion of a child's life, he felt something break inside him. The carefully constructed walls between his past as a healer and his present as an administrator crumbled. In that moment, he saw with terrible clarity what he had become. The same system that had killed Sarah was now preparing to claim another victim. The same justifications he had used to silence his conscience were being deployed again. The same corruption that had torn families apart was being perpetuated under his leadership. But changing course would come at an enormous personal cost. The board had evidence of his complicity in years of questionable decisions. His signature appeared on documents that could destroy his career and reputation. The very wealth and power he had accumulated could be used against him if he chose to fight. That night, Daniel found himself in the hospital chapel, a place he hadn't visited since Sarah's death. In the quiet darkness, he remembered their early days together, when healing was a calling rather than a business. He thought of Amanda Thompson dying during a double shift in the hospital she served. He thought of Leo fighting for life in a system that saw him as a liability rather than a child in need. The choice before him was stark: continue protecting a corrupt system and watch another family shatter, or risk everything to fight for change. Either way, there would be casualties. Either way, lives would be altered forever. The question was whether he could live with himself if he chose wrong again. In the oncology ward, Claire confronted her own demons. Years of watching injustice, of cleaning the rooms of patients who died unnecessarily, of keeping silent to protect her job, it all culminated in this moment. She had evidence that could expose everything, but using it might cost her the very job that provided Leo's basic insurance. As dawn broke over St. Mary's, both Daniel and Claire made decisions that would set them on a collision course with the hospital's power structure. Neither knew of the other's choice, but their separate paths were about to converge in ways that would shake the institution to its foundations. In his hospital bed, Leo made one final diary entry before his strength failed. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. But Mom said forgiveness is how we heal not just our bodies, but our hearts too. His words would prove prophetic in the days to come, as St. Mary's faced its own moment of reckoning. The decision that would change St. Mary's forever was made at 3:47 a.m. in the sterile silence of Daniel Richardson's office. Outside, a winter storm battered the hospital windows, while inside, Leo's latest medical report lay open on his desk. Patient critically unstable, immediate intervention required. Beside it sat the hospital board's latest directive: maintain current protocols regarding charitable care allocation. Daniel's hands shook as he began copying files, thousands of documents detailing years of corruption. Each click of his keyboard felt like a heartbeat, echoing the monitors in Leo's room 15 floors below. He thought of Sarah, of how she would have handled this moment. The truth doesn't ask permission, she used to say. It demands to be heard. Across the hospital, Claire Thompson was making her own decisive move. During her night cleaning shift, she had discovered something in Thomas Wells's private office, a detailed ledger of discretionary fund allocations. That read like a who's who of wealthy patients receiving charitable care meant for cases like Leo's. With trembling fingers, she photographed every page, knowing this evidence could cost her more than just her job. The storm outside intensified as both Claire and Daniel, unknown to each other, prepared their separate strikes against the system. In the oncology ward, Leo drifted between consciousness and fever dreams, his small hand still clutching his diary. His latest entry was barely legible. Sometimes the biggest storms bring the most beautiful rainbows. At 4:15 a.m., Daniel began composing an email to the hospital's ethics board, the state medical board, and selected investigative journalists. His finger hesitated over the send button as memories flooded back: board meetings where he had stayed silent, funding decisions he had approved, lives he had helped ruin through action or inaction. The weight of those choices pressed down on him like physical pain. Meanwhile, Claire worked methodically through her cleaning routine, her phone heavy with evidence in her pocket. Each room she cleaned held memories. Here was where Amanda had worked her final shift. There was where she had first noticed Leo's bruises, and everywhere were echoes of lives affected by the hospital's corrupted priorities. The pivotal moment came at dawn. Dr. Matthews, finishing another exhausting night shift, intercepted Claire in the hallway. "Leo's numbers are dropping," she whispered, "without intervention in the next 48 hours. She left the sentence unfinished, but its meaning was clear. In his office, Daniel received the same update via email, the clinical language doing little to mask its urgency. The storm broke as sunrise painted the hospital windows in shades of gold and pink. In that moment of natural beauty, both Daniel and Claire made their final decisions. He pressed send on his email, then began a second message, this one to the board, announcing his intention to provide immediate care to Leo Thompson, protocol be damned. Claire, having finished her shift, walked into the hospital's main lobby still wearing her cleaning uniform. Local news crews were already gathering outside, tipped off by an anonymous source about potential revelations of healthcare corruption. She clutched her phone, containing not just the evidence she had gathered, but a video she had recorded hours earlier, her public testimony about everything she had witnessed. In the oncology ward, Leo stirred in his sleep, his fever finally breaking. His last diary entry sat unfinished on his bedside table. "I dreamed that Mr. Richardson remembered how to be a doctor again. Mom always said everyone deserves a chance to make things right." The decisions made that morning would trigger a chain of events that would reshape St. Mary's forever. Daniel's email would reach those who could force change at the highest levels. Claire's evidence would provide the proof needed to support his claims. And Leo's diary, with its innocent observations of systemic corruption, would become the human heart of a story that could no longer be ignored. Neither Daniel nor Claire knew if their actions would save Leo's life. They didn't know if the truth would bring healing or just more pain. But in choosing to act, they had already begun to heal something just as critical as any patient, the broken spirit of a hospital that had lost its way. But as the new day dawned over St. Mary's, the storm clouds parted, revealing a sky as clear and bright as truth itself. The decisions had been made. Now would come the consequences, the confrontations, and perhaps the chance for redemption that Leo had seen in his fever dreams. The investigation into St. Mary's Hospital began not with a bang, but with a series of quiet revelations that rippled through the institution like aftershocks from an earthquake. Within hours of Daniel's email blast, state investigators arrived unannounced, their badges glinting in the morning sun. They moved through the hospital with methodical precision, sealing offices and securing records before anyone could begin the inevitable process of covering tracks. Daniel watched from his office as Thomas Wells and other board members were escorted from their morning meeting. The look of betrayal on their faces when they saw him still at his desk, calmly handing over documents, would haunt him for years. "You've destroyed everything we built," Wells spat as he passed. "Everything we built was already destroyed," Daniel replied quietly. "We just couldn't see the ruins for the profit margins." The investigation team, led by a sharp-eyed woman named Alexandra Carter, set up command in the hospital's conference room. She had a reputation for being thorough and incorruptible, with a particular interest in healthcare fraud. "Show me everything," she told Daniel during their first meeting. Every decision, every denial, every death that could have been prevented. Claire Thompson's evidence proved invaluable. Her years of careful documentation, combined with Leo's innocent but damning observations, painted a picture of systematic corruption that was impossible to ignore. The investigators were particularly moved by Leo's diary entries, which provided a child's eye view of the hospital's ethical collapse. "Sometimes the grown-ups forget that hospitals are supposed to make people better," he had written. "They're too busy counting money to count heartbeats." As the investigation deepened, more staff members came forward. Nurses shared stories of being forced to turn away critical patients while board members' relatives received immediate care. doctors revealed how they had been pressured to prioritize profitable procedures over necessary ones. Even the accounting department provided records of suspicious charitable fund allocations. The most damning evidence came from Sarah Richardson's medical file. The investigators discovered that the experimental treatment denied to her had been approved for another patient just weeks later, one with connections to the board. The decision had been signed by Thomas Wells himself, using funds that should have gone to the hospital's emergency care program. Daniel spent hours in interviews, explaining how the corruption had evolved so gradually that it became normalized. He shared emails, meeting minutes, and his own notes from years of board meetings. "We didn't set out to build a system that killed people," he told Inspector Carter. "We just stopped seeing them as people and started seeing them as numbers." The investigation uncovered a complex web of kickbacks, diverted funds, and preferential treatment that stretched back over a decade. Board members had used the hospital's charitable foundation as their personal medical fund while denying care to thousands of patients like Leo. The numbers were staggering: millions in misappropriated funds, hundreds of denied treatments, dozens of preventable deaths. But it was the human stories that caught the public's attention when the investigation's findings began to leak. Stories like Amanda Thompson's death during an understaffed night shift, or Sarah Richardson's denied treatment, or Leo's ongoing battle for care. Each revelation brought more witnesses forward, more evidence to light, more proof of how deeply the corruption had penetrated. Through it all, Leo's condition continued to deteriorate. The investigators, hardened by years of seeing healthcare fraud, were visibly moved by the sight of Claire reading to her nephew between providing testimony. "He's why we're here," Inspector Carter reminded her team when the hours grew long. Him and every other patient who was seen as a liability instead of a life. The investigation reached a turning point when they discovered the board's emergency protocol override codes, used frequently for wealthy patients but denied to critical cases like Leo's. This discovery led to the most difficult day of the investigation, reviewing records of every patient who had died after being denied care, while the override codes were used for non-emergency cases. As Daniel helped compile this grim data, he found himself returning to Leo's diary entries. The boy's simple wisdom cut through years of corporate justification. If hospitals are supposed to help people get better, why do they make some people wait until they're too sick to help? Mom would say that's not healing, that's hurting. The investigation's preliminary findings were enough to force emergency changes at St. Mary's. The board was suspended pending criminal charges, and a state oversight committee took control of hospital operations. But for those at the heart of the story, Daniel, Claire, and most critically, Leo, the question remained whether these changes would come in time to make a difference where it mattered most. 1 month into the investigation, Inspector Carter found Daniel standing at Leo's window, watching Claire tend to her nephew. "You know this could end your career," she said quietly. "Probably end in criminal charges for some of your decisions." Daniel nodded, not taking his eyes off the scene before him. "Some things matter more than careers," he replied. "I just forgot that for a while." The unlikely partnership between Daniel Richardson and Claire Thompson began on a rain-soaked evening in the hospital chapel. Claire found him there, kneeling in the same pew where he'd said goodbye to Sarah years ago. Without a word, she placed Leo's diary on the bench between them. The simple gesture bridged years of hostility and mistrust, creating a connection forged in shared pain and common purpose. "Leo writes about you, you know," Claire said softly, opening the diary to a marked page. "He says you look at the hospital the way I look at his empty bedroom, like you've lost something precious and don't know how to get it back." The words hit Daniel like physical blows, stripping away the last of his corporate armor. Together, they began mapping out the extent of St. Mary's corruption. Claire's years of observations from the hospital's shadows complemented Daniel's insider knowledge of board decisions. They worked through nights in his office, cross-referencing denied treatments against board members' personal use of charitable funds, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss. Their alliance drew others into its orbit. Dr. Matthews provided detailed medical records showing pattern of care discrimination. Former nurses who had quit in protest returned to share their stories. Even the hospital's department quietly granted access to emails and financial records that might otherwise have been accidentally deleted. The most unexpected alley emerged in Rebecca Wells, the board chairman's daughter. Troubled by her own role as a beneficiary of misappropriated funds, she provided crucial testimony about how her father and other board members had manipulated the system. Her social media video of Leo's cafeteria collapse had already gone viral, putting a human face on the hospital's ethical crisis. As their evidence mounted, so did the personal risks. Daniel received thinly veiled threats from board members' lawyers. Claire faced harassment from hospital administrators trying to discredit her testimony. "They're scared," Leo observed during one of his lucid moments. Mom said people get meanest when they're scared of the truth. The alliance's work took on greater urgency as Leo's condition worsened. Each denied treatment, each delayed procedure had pushed him closer to a point of no return. Working against time, Daniel and Claire raced to expose enough corruption to force emergency intervention before it was too late. Their breakthrough came through an unexpected source: the hospital's cleaning staff. Years of working night shifts had made them invisible to administrators, allowing them to witness countless damning conversations. They provided recordings, photographs, and first-hand accounts of board members discussing how to divert charitable funds for personal use. The alliance grew into a movement within St. Mary's. Staff members began wearing small blue ribbons, Leo's favorite color, as a silent symbol of support. Patients shared their own stories of discrimination and delayed care. Even some board members' families, troubled by what they were learning, reached out to offer evidence. Daniel and Claire worked in perfect synchronization, their shared mission healing old wounds. He saw in her the same dedication to truth that Sarah had embodied. She recognized in him the healer who had lost his way but was fighting to find it again. Their partnership became a symbol of the change they were fighting to create. Leo watched their alliance grow from his hospital bed, documenting everything in his increasingly shaky handwriting. "Aunt Claire and Mr. Richardson remind me of the superheroes in my comics," he wrote. "Not the kind with powers, but the kind who fight for what's right even when it's hard." The alliance faced its greatest test when Thomas Wells launched a counterattack, threatening to expose Daniel's past complicity in the corruption. Instead of breaking their partnership, the threat strengthened it. Claire stood by Daniel as he publicly acknowledged his role, turning his confession into a powerful testimony about the system's ability to corrupt even those who meant to heal. Their partnership extended beyond the investigation. During Leo's rough nights, Daniel would often find Claire sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair, her cleaning uniform still on. He'd bring her coffee and take the night watch, reading from Leo's diary while she rested. These quiet moments of shared vigil deepened their commitment to the cause. As word of their alliance spread, other hospitals began reporting similar patterns of corruption. What had started as a fight to save one child was becoming a movement to reform an entire system. Through it all, Leo's diary remained their touchstone, his innocent observations cutting through layers of corporate justification to expose the simple truth: a hospital's purpose was to heal, not to profit from suffering. The alliance between a former CEO and a hospital janitor would have seemed impossible months ago. But as they worked together in the quiet hours of night, surrounded by evidence of corruption and driven by the urgency of Leo's condition, they discovered that purpose matters more than position, and truth knows no hierarchy. The backlash began swiftly and mercilessly. Within days of Daniel and Claire's alliance becoming public, Thomas Wells and the board launched a coordinated campaign to discredit them both. Anonymous letters appeared in staff mailboxes detailing Daniel's past involvement in questionable decisions. Security footage of Claire accessing private offices during her cleaning shifts was leaked, attempting to paint her as a disgruntled employee stealing corporate secrets. The hospital's legal team worked overtime, sending cease and desist letters to anyone who spoke to investigators. Long-term employees suddenly found their positions under review. Dr. Matthews faced an emergency credentials committee, her treatment decisions scrutinized for any possible mistakes. The message was clear: support the investigation, and your career would be destroyed. Wells's influence extended beyond the hospital. Local media outlets, dependent on St. Mary's advertising revenue, began running stories questioning the investigation's motives. Business leaders, many with connections to the hospital board, publicly defended the current system as necessary for maintaining quality care. Even some patients whose treatments had been funded by the charitable foundation were pressured to speak against reform. But resistance to the resistance was already growing. Hospital staff began documenting the intimidation attempts, adding to the evidence pile. Anonymous social media accounts shared Leo's story, along with others like it. Rebecca Wells, despite her father's threats to disinherit her, continued providing damning information about the board's private discussions. The turning point came when Leo's diary entries began appearing online. No one knew who was leaking them. Claire swore it wasn't her, and Daniel was equally mystified. But the simple, powerful observations of a dying child cut through the corporate spin. Today, they told another family they couldn't help their daughter. The man in the suit said it was protocol, but Mum taught me that's just a fancy word for rules, and rules can be changed when they hurt people. The resistance took on a life of its own. Nurses started wearing recording devices during board member interactions. Its staff accidentally copied incriminating emails before they could be deleted. Even the hospital's janitorial team joined in, carefully preserving documents they found in waste paper baskets during their night shifts. Daniel faced the harshest attacks. His past decisions were dissected in board meetings, his personal life scrutinized for any weakness. The same system he had helped build now turned its full force against him. Yet each attempt to discredit him only strengthened his resolve. "They're using the playbook I helped write," he told Claire during one late-night strategy session. "But they've forgotten what Sarah taught me: the truth doesn't need a playbook." Claire faced more subtle but equally damaging resistance. Her work schedule was constantly changed, making it harder to care for Leo. Anonymous complaints appeared in her file. Other cleaning staff were warned not to help her during shifts. Yet she continued her methodical documentation, supported by a growing network of hospital workers who saw her as a symbol of courage. The resistance's most potent weapon was fear of losing jobs, fear of legal consequences, fear of being blacklisted in the healthcare industry. But Leo's deteriorating condition provided an urgency that overcame fear. But every day he grew weaker was another reminder of what they were fighting for. Legal threats escalated. Board members' lawyers demanded access to Leo's medical records, claiming his case was being exploited for political purposes. They attempted to have Claire banned from the hospital outside her work hours, citing security concerns. Daniel faced multiple ethics board reviews, each designed to discredit his testimony. Yet for every act of intimidation, there was an equal act of solidarity. When Claire was scheduled for back-to-back shifts, other cleaning staff covered for her. When Dr. Matthews faced the credentials committee, dozens of fellow doctors submitted letters supporting her decisions. When Daniel's ethics reviews were scheduled, hospital staff filled the hallways wearing blue ribbons. Leo watched it all from his hospital bed, his diary entries becoming shorter but more profound. The grown-ups fighting the truth are like the bullies at school. They're loud and scary, but they're really just afraid. Mom said courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified. The resistance reached its peak when Thomas Wells called an emergency board meeting to vote on closing the pediatric oncology ward, a direct threat to Leo and other critical patients. But he hadn't counted on the staff's determination. As board members arrived, they found the hospital surrounded by employees, patients, and community members holding vigil. Inside, nurses and doctors continued caring for patients while wearing signs that read healthcare is a right, not a privilege. In his office, Daniel received a final threat evidence of his involvement in decisions that had cost lives, with an offer to lose it if he withdrew his testimony. At the same time, Claire was offered a promotion and a transfer to another hospital if she would retract her statements. Both threats arrived with the same message: think about your futures. Looking out over the crowd of supporters, then back at Leo's latest diary entry, sometimes you have to lose everything to save what matters most. They made their choices. The resistance had become bigger than any individual's future. It was about saving the soul of a hospital, and through it, perhaps, the soul of healthcare itself. The final confrontation at St. Mary's Hospital unfolded during a storm-swept board meeting that would later be known as the Night of Truth. Thunder rattled the windows of the conference room as Thomas Wells called the emergency session to order, his face tight with suppressed rage. The entire board was present, along with their lawyers, hospital administrators, and unexpectedly Daniel Richardson and Claire Thompson. The atmosphere crackled with tension as Wells launched his opening salvo. "We're here to address the malicious campaign of lies that threatens to destroy this institution," he began, but Daniel cut him off by silently placing Leo's diary in the center of the conference table. The simple notebook, worn from constant use, seemed to pulse with its own power. "Before you continue," Thomas Daniel said quietly, "I think we should read what a dying child has to say about our institution." He opened the diary to a marked page and began reading Leo's observations about the hospital's two-tiered care system, about whispered conversations regarding profitable patients, about families crying in hallways while board members' relatives received immediate treatment. Claire stood beside him, her janitor's uniform replaced by her old nurse's scrubs, her tablet displaying years of methodically documented evidence. As Daniel read, she projected photos onto the conference room screen: empty charity care funds alongside board members' vacation homes, denied treatment authorizations next to approved cosmetic procedures for the wealthy, staff reduction metrics alongside rising executive bonuses. The board's lawyers moved to shut down the presentation, citing confidentiality agreements and threatening immediate legal action. But they were interrupted by an unexpected voice. Rebecca Wells, Thomas's daughter, stepped into the room. "I'd like to add my testimony," she announced, her phone held high, playing the viral video of Leo's collapse and the hospital's delayed response. What followed was 3 hours of raw truth. Staff members who had been quietly gathering evidence for years came forward. Dr. Matthews presented statistics showing the direct correlation between denied care and increased mortality rates. Former board members, their consciences finally outweighing their loyalty, confirmed the systematic abuse of charitable funds. The confrontation reached its climax when Claire played her final piece of evidence, a recording of her sister Amanda's last shift, where she had documented the dangerous understaffing just hours before her fatal collapse. "My sister died serving this hospital," Claire said, her voice steady. "Leo is dying because of this hospital. How many more families have to be destroyed before we remember what healing means?" Thomas Wells attempted to regain control, citing the hospital's financial obligations and market realities, but Daniel was ready. He presented a detailed analysis showing how the money spent on legal fees defending corrupt practices could have funded treatment for hundreds of patients like Leo. "We're not losing money by helping people," he argued. "We're losing our souls by refusing to help." The confrontation took an unexpected turn when an elderly board member, Dr. James Morrison, suddenly stood up. "I can't do this anymore," he announced, his voice shaking. He pulled out a file containing decades of notes about questionable decisions, including the true reason for Sarah Richardson's denied treatment. "Daniel," he said, "your wife didn't die because the treatment was too risky. She died because Wells had already allocated those funds for his daughter's elective surgery." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Daniel gripped the table, his knuckles white, as years of carefully constructed justifications crumbled, Claire reached for his hand, offering silent support as the full weight of the corruption became clear. Wells made a final desperate attempt to maintain control, threatening to expose everyone's complicity in the system. "You'll all go down with me," he warned. "Every decision, every denial, every death, you're all responsible." But his threats fell flat as board members, one by one, began sliding their resignation letters across the table. The confrontation reached its tragic climax when Dr. Matthews burst into the room. "Leo's coding," she announced. The words cut through the tension like a knife. Claire turned to run to her nephew, but Daniel stopped her. "No," he said, facing the board. "Let them come. Let them see what their policies really mean." In a moment that would later be described as divine justice, the entire board was forced to walk through the hospital to the pediatric oncology ward. They passed dozens of staff members wearing blue ribbons, patients and families holding vigil, and community members who had gathered in support. Each face was a testament to the human cost of their decisions. As they reached Leo's room, where medical staff fought to stabilize him, Thomas Wells finally broke. Watching his own daughter, Rebecca, join the medical team trying to save Leo's life, he saw the truth he had spent years denying, that every denied treatment, every diverted fund, every policy that prioritized profit over care had led to this moment. The confrontation ended not with a bang, but with a silence more powerful than any words. In that quiet moment, broken only by the beeping of Leo's monitors, the old system of St. Mary's Hospital died. What would rise from its ashes remained to be seen, but one thing was clear: the truth had finally been heard. In the chaos following Leo's cardiac arrest, Daniel Richardson faced the most crucial decision of his career. The hospital's emergency protocols still required financial clearance before administering certain life-saving treatments, and Leo's case remained officially pending. With the board in disarray and no clear chain of command, the choice fell to him: follow the protocols he had helped create, or break them to save a child's life. Time moved with excruciating slowness as medical staff worked to stabilize Leo. Claire stood frozen by his bedside, her nurse's training warring with her aunt's terror. Dr. Matthews had already prepared the experimental treatment that could save him, the same treatment that had been denied to Sarah Richardson years ago. The cost would be astronomical, the legal implications severe. Thomas Wells, still present from the confrontation, saw his opportunity. "Think carefully, Daniel," he warned. "Authorize this treatment, and you admit to years of wrongful denials. Every family who lost someone will come after the hospital after you." His words carried the weight of countless past decisions, of lives lost to protocols and policies. The hospital staff watched the scene unfold, understanding its significance. This wasn't just about saving one child, it was about breaking a system that had caused countless deaths. Rebecca Wells, still in her scrubs from helping with Leo's resuscitation, turned to her father. "How many more have to die before we do what's right?" she demanded. Claire's voice cut through the tension. "He has a name," she said quietly, her hand on Leo's pale forehead. "Every patient you turned away had a name, a family, a story. Leo wrote about them all in his diary. He saw what we pretended not to see." She pulled out the diary, opening to one of the final entries. "Sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting, it's admitting you were wrong and trying to make it right." Daniel stood at the foot of Leo's bed, memories washing over him. Sarah in her final days, begging him to remember his calling as a healer. Amanda Thompson, dying on a night shift because of cut corners and profit margins. Every face, every name he had allowed to become a statistic in the name of fiscal responsibility. The hospital's legal team arrived, armed with injunctions and liability warnings. This decision could bankrupt the hospital, they cautioned. The precedent alone could bring down the entire healthcare system. But as they spoke, more staff members appeared wearing blue ribbons, their silent presence a reminder of healthcare's true purpose. Dr. Matthews approached Daniel with the treatment authorization form. "I've already documented everything," she said. "Whatever you decide, there's no going back to the way things were," her words echoed in the tense silence of the ICU, where machines kept Leo's fragile heart beating. Claire watched Daniel, seeing not the hospital CEO but the young doctor from Sarah's photographs, the one who had believed in healing above all else. "She would be proud of you," she whispered. "Sarah would want you to remember who you were before the system changed you." The choice before Daniel was clear yet impossible. Authorize the treatment, and he would implicitly admit to years of wrongful denials, opening the hospital to devastating lawsuits. Refuse and watch another child die because of policies he had helped create. His entire career, his reputation, the very future of St. Mary's hung in the balance. Leo's monitors beeped steadily as Daniel looked around the room. He saw the faces of nurses who had watched too many patients die unnecessarily, doctors forced to choose between their ethics and their careers, staff members who had carried the weight of impossible choices. In Leo's pale face, he saw every patient he had failed. Oh, with hands that trembled slightly, Daniel took the authorization form. The room held its breath as he looked at Thomas Wells one last time. "You're right," he said quietly. "This could destroy everything we built." He turned to Claire, his voice stronger. "But what we built was wrong. It's time to rebuild something better." His signature on the form was more than an authorization for treatment. It was an admission of guilt, a confession of complicity, a declaration of war against a system that had lost its way. As Dr. Matthews rushed to begin the treatment, Daniel turned to face the consequences of his choice. Legal teams scrambled to contain the damage, but it was too late. The choice had been made, the precedent set. News spread through the hospital like wildfire. St. Mary's was changing, starting now. Staff members began pulling out their own documentation of denied care, preparing for the battle ahead. Claire caught Daniel's hand as he turned to leave, her eyes full of understanding. "Thank you," she whispered, "for choosing healing over hiding in that moment." They both knew that while the fight ahead would be brutal, they had finally taken the first step toward redemption. As night fell over St. Mary's, the choice that would change everything had been made. In Leo's room, machines hummed with new purpose, delivering treatment that might save his life. But the real healing had already begun, not just for one child, but for an entire institution that had finally remembered its true purpose. The legal and ethical battle that engulfed St. Mary's Hospital in the days following Daniel's decision transformed the institution into a battlefield of competing ideals. News vans clogged the parking lots, their satellite dishes sprouting like mechanical flowers. Inside, lawyers prowled the corridors while investigators combed through decades of records, and amid it all, Leo fought for his life in the pediatric ICU. The first lawsuit arrived within hours, a class action representing families of patients who had been denied the same treatment now being given to Leo. The hospital's legal team, led by Thomas Wells's personal attorney, argued that authorizing Leo's treatment had been an emotional, not medical decision. They painted Daniel as a man broken by guilt over his wife's death, making irrational choices that threatened the hospital's stability. But they hadn't counted on the evidence. Years of documented cases poured in from staff members who had been quietly building their own records. Nurses produced logs of denied treatments alongside approved cosmetic procedures. Doctors shared emails ordering them to prioritize profitable patients. Even maintenance staff contributed security footage of late-night board meetings where care decisions were traded like commodities. The media seized on the story, particularly after Rebecca Wells went public with her own testimony. "I received treatments that others were denied," she admitted in a devastating television interview. "My father called it protecting the hospital's interests, but now I understand we were just protecting our privileges at the cost of other people's lives." Daniel faced the battle on multiple fronts. By day, he testified before medical boards and ethics committees, methodically exposing the system of corruption he had helped maintain. By night, he worked with Claire and Dr. Matthews, reviewing cases of patients who might now have a chance at treatment. His testimony was damning precisely because it was a confession. "I didn't set out to hurt people," he told one hearing. "I just stopped seeing them as people." The hospital board, now suspended pending investigation, launched a counter-offensive. They leaked emails suggesting Claire had manipulated Leo's condition for financial gain. They claimed Leo's diary had been doctored to create controversy. They even attempted to have Dr. Matthews' medical license suspended for protocol violations. But the truth had gained too much momentum to be stopped. Other hospitals began reporting similar patterns of corruption. Medical staff across the country started coming forward with their own stories. What had begun as one hospital's crisis was exposing systemic issues in healthcare itself. The battle's unexpected heroes were the hospital's lowest-paid workers. Cleaning staff testified about conversations overheard during night shifts. Cafeteria workers recalled board members joking about budget patients. Maintenance personnel produced maintenance logs showing expensive renovations to board members' private suites, while essential equipment went unrepaired. Through it all, Leo's condition remained critical but stable. The experimental treatment that had been denied to so many was finally having a chance to prove its worth. Each small improvement in his condition became a symbol of what might have been possible for others if profit hadn't trumped care. Claire balanced her time between supporting Leo's treatment and fighting for systemic change. Her testimony before state medical boards was powerful precisely because it came from someone who had seen the system from every angle, as a nurse, as a janitor, as a family member desperate for care. "The system isn't broken," she told one hearing. "It's working exactly as designed. That's the problem." The battle reached a turning point when Dr. James Morrison, the elderly board member who had exposed Sarah's true case history, suffered a stroke. In his final lucid moments, he signed a complete confession detailing decades of systematic corruption. His death days later turned him into a symbol of conscience, finally outweighing complicity. Public opinion shifted dramatically as more stories emerged. Local businesses withdrew funding from board members' pet projects. Medical students began demanding ethics reform in their training. Even insurance companies, sensing the changing tide, started revising their coverage policies. But the most powerful weapon in the battle proved to be Leo's diary. Published excerpts went viral, his simple observations cutting through years of corporate justification. Today, they told another family they couldn't help their daughter. "The man in the suit said it was protocol, but Mom taught me that's just a fancy word for rules. And rules can be changed when they hurt people." Daniel found himself leading a movement he hadn't intended to start. His office became a command center for reform, where doctors, lawyers, and activists worked to draft new policies based on care rather than profit. "We're not just fighting for Leo anymore," he told his growing team. "We're fighting for every patient who comes after him." As the battle intensified, St. Mary's itself began to transform. Staff members spoke up in meetings without fear. Patient care decisions were made transparently. The hospital's mission statement, hanging in the lobby since its founding, seemed to take on new meaning: to heal with compassion and serve with dignity. The cost was enormous financially, professionally, personally. But as Claire told a young reporter who asked if it was worth it, some costs are higher than money. The cost of staying silent, of watching people suffer because of artificial barriers to care, that's a price too high to keep paying. In Leo's room, where machines continued their life-saving work, his latest diary entry lay open. "Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought with fists or words, but with the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. Mom would be proud of them all." These characters deserve every like for their courage and resilience in fighting for what's right. Sadly, they haven't received the recognition they deserve. If their story touches your heart, let's show our support with a simple like. The night Leo Thompson died was deceptively peaceful. Snow fell softly outside his hospital window, each flake catching the light like a falling star. The experimental treatment had shown promise initially, but his body, weakened by months of delayed care, couldn't sustain the fight. He slipped away quietly at 3:17 a.m., his small hand still clutching his diary, Claire's head resting on the edge of his bed. Daniel Richardson received the call in his office, where he'd been working through another stack of case reviews. The news hit him with physical force, sending him stumbling to the window. Below, the emergency room lights pulsed steadily, a rhythm that suddenly seemed obscene in its regularity. Everything continued as normal, even though nothing would ever be normal again. Claire's grief was a tangible thing, filling the hospital room with its weight. She sat motionless beside Leo's bed, one hand still holding his, the other gripping his diary. The nurses who came to disconnect the monitors moved with gentle reverence, many of them crying openly. These weren't just professional tears. Leo had touched them all with his quiet wisdom and unfailing kindness. Dr. Matthews broke down in the hallway, her professional composure finally cracking. "We were so close," she sobbed to a colleague. "If we'd started the treatment months ago, when I first recommended it." Her words echoed what everyone was thinking, that Leo's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a preventable one. The news spread through St. Mary's like a slow-moving wave. Staff members who had worn blue ribbons in support of Leo's fight gathered spontaneously in the hospital chapel. Others left flowers outside his room, along with notes sharing how his story had changed their perspective on healthcare. Even patients in nearby rooms felt the loss, having grown accustomed to hearing Claire read from Leo's diary during quiet evenings. Daniel found himself walking the hospital corridors aimlessly, memories washing over him. He remembered Sarah's final days, how he'd buried his grief in work and rationalization. But Leo's death was different. It was a direct result of the system he'd helped create. Each step took him past another reminder: the administrative office where Leo's initial treatment request had been denied, the conference room where board members had discussed cost-benefit analyses of pediatric care, the cafeteria where Leo had collapsed that fateful day. When he finally entered Leo's room, Claire looked up with eyes that held no accusation, only a profound, exhausted sadness. "He wrote something for you," she said softly, holding out the diary. The final entry, written in shaky handwriting, read, "Tell Mr. Richardson it's okay. Mom says sometimes the biggest changes come from the deepest losses. Maybe my story will help other kids get the care they need." The morning shift arrived to find the hospital transformed. Staff members moved through their duties with quiet determination, many wearing black ribbons alongside their blue ones. The usual bustle of administrative activity seemed muted, as if the institution itself was in mourning. In the pediatric ward, other young patients asked about the boy who had always had a smile and a kind word for everyone. Rebecca Wells arrived with flowers, only to find the hallway outside Leo's room already filled with tributes. She stood there crying, remembering how her own treatment had been fast-tracked while Leo waited. Her father, Thomas Wells, watched from a distance, his face showing the first cracks in his corporate armor as he witnessed the impact of one child's death on an entire institution. The loss wasn't just personal, it was institutional. Leo had become a symbol of everything wrong with the healthcare system, and his death threatened to derail the reforms that had begun. Some board members, still fighting to maintain the status quo, suggested that his case proved the futility of expensive treatments for terminal patients. They couldn't have been more wrong. As morning light filled the hospital rooms, Claire finally stood up from her vigil. She gathered Leo's belongings with careful tenderness, his favorite books, the cards from hospital staff, and most importantly, his diary. Walking out of the room, she passed Daniel in the hallway. Without a word, they both understood that while the battle for Leo's life was over, the war for healthcare reform was just beginning. The loss of Leo Thompson would prove to be more than a personal tragedy. It would become the catalyst for change that he had unknowingly predicted in his diary. But in that moment of raw grief, as snow continued to fall outside his window, all that mattered was the absence of one bright soul who had seen the truth and dared to write it down. The days following Leo's death witnessed an unprecedented transformation at St. Mary's Hospital. The morning after he passed, staff members arrived to find copies of his final diary entry posted anonymously throughout the building. His words, written with the simple clarity of a child, cut through years of corporate justification. Sometimes grown-ups forget that hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, not hurting. Maybe my story will help them remember. The public reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Local news stations ran continuous coverage of Leo's story, interweaving it with testimonies from other families who had faced similar barriers to care. Social media exploded with the hashtag #RememberLeo as people shared their own experiences of denied medical treatment. The hospital's phone lines were flooded with calls from across the country, many from medical professionals offering to help implement reforms. Thomas Wells and the remaining board members attempted damage control, issuing a carefully worded statement about reviewing internal policies and commitment to patient care. Their words rang hollow against the background of Leo's documented experiences. When they tried to hold a press conference, they found the hospital staff had organized a silent protest, standing in the lobby wearing blue ribbons and holding pages from Leo's diary. Claire withdrew into deep mourning, but her grief became a powerful symbol. She continued her cleaning shifts, now wearing both her nurse's badge and her custodian's uniform, a visible reminder of her journey through the hospital's hierarchy. Staff members and patients alike would find her in Leo's former room during breaks, reading his diary entries aloud to anyone who would listen. Daniel Richardson faced his own form of purgatory. He spent hours in his office, reviewing every decision he'd made as CEO, every policy he'd implemented, every life he'd potentially affected. The weight of responsibility crushed him anew each time he passed the pediatric oncology ward. Yet he refused to resign, understanding that running away would dishonor both Leo's memory and Sarah's legacy. The hospital board's collapse came not with a bang, but with a series of quiet surrenders. First, Rebecca Wells published a detailed account of how her father had manipulated the charitable care system. Then Dr. Morrison's full confession went public, revealing decades of systematic discrimination in patient care. Finally, an independent audit confirmed every observation in Leo's diary, from denied treatments to misappropriated funds. Medical staff began implementing changes without waiting for official approval. Dr. Matthews established new protocols for pediatric care that prioritized medical necessity over financial status. Nurses created a patient advocacy program, ensuring every family had support in navigating the healthcare system. Even the administrative staff joined in, streamlining processes to remove unnecessary barriers to treatment. The media attention brought unexpected allies. Other hospitals reached out, sharing similar stories and seeking guidance on reform. Medical schools requested copies of Leo's diary for their ethics courses. Healthcare advocacy groups used his story to push for legislative changes. What had begun as one child's observations was becoming a movement for systematic change. Claire found an unlikely source of comfort in her grief. Families whose children had been denied care began seeking her out, sharing their stories and asking for guidance. She started organizing them into a support network, using Leo's diary as a blueprint for documenting and challenging healthcare inequities. Her nephew's death had given her a new purpose, ensuring no other family would face the same battle alone. Daniel's transformation was more subtle but equally profound. He stopped wearing suits, returning to his doctor's white coat. He began doing regular rounds, meeting with patients and their families, listening to their stories. In board meetings now held with complete transparency, he would often reference Leo's diary entries as a reminder of their true mission. The aftermath of Leo's death revealed the power of truth told simply. His diary, with its unvarnished observations and childlike wisdom, accomplished what years of investigations and complaints had failed to do. It made people care. Each entry became a testament to both what was wrong with the healthcare system and what it could become. As winter deepened around St. Mary's, the changes Leo had dreamed of began taking root. The The hospital's mission statement was rewritten, incorporating words from his diary to heal with compassion, serve with dignity, and ensure that every life matters equally. His room in the pediatric ward was transformed into a patient advocacy center, its walls covered with his drawings and writings. In the end, the aftermath of Leo Thompson's death proved to be just the beginning of a larger story. His loss became a catalyst for change, his words a guide for reform, and his spirit a reminder of what healthcare should be. The system that had failed him was being dismantled, piece by piece, replaced by something closer to what he had imagined in his final diary entries. Leo Thompson's legacy began to take shape 3 weeks after his death, when Claire discovered a hidden section in his diary. Between its worn pages lay a carefully folded letter, addressed simply to those who need hope. The letter contained not accusations or anger, but a child's blueprint for what a hospital could be: detailed drawings of gardens where patients could heal, notes about doctors who took time to listen, and plans for ensuring no family would be turned away. The discovery coincided with a crucial state healthcare board meeting where St. Mary's future hung in the balance. Daniel Richardson stood before the committee, Leo's letter in hand, and read the young boy's vision aloud. The room fell silent as Leo's words painted a picture of healthcare transformed. Hospitals shouldn't be places where money decides who lives or dies. They should be places where everyone gets a chance to heal. Claire turned Leo's room into the first patient advocacy center, its walls adorned with his drawings and observations. The center became a sanctuary where families could find support navigating the healthcare system. Staff members volunteered their time, inspired by Leo's simple wisdom. Sometimes people just need someone to hold their hand and tell them they're not alone. The media dubbed it the Leo Effect, a grassroots movement spreading across healthcare institutions nationwide. His diary, published with Claire's permission, became required reading in medical schools. Students wrote essays analyzing his observations, while hospital administrators used his experiences to identify systemic failures in their own institutions. Other hospitals began establishing their own advocacy centers, each incorporating elements from Leo's vision. Gardens appeared in oncology wards, painted murals brightened pediatric units, and most importantly, new policies emerged prioritizing patient care over profit. His legacy was becoming a revolution in healthcare consciousness. Daniel honored Leo's memory by creating a transparent charitable care system. The Leo Thompson Memorial Fund ensured that no child would be denied treatment due to financial constraints. The fund's oversight committee included medical staff, former patients, and community members, a direct response to Leo's observation that helping people shouldn't be a secret club. The most profound aspect of Leo's legacy was the change in hospital culture. Staff members began keeping their own Leo diaries, documenting both problems and solutions they encountered. These records created a powerful tool for continuous improvement, fulfilling Leo's belief that if you write down what's wrong, someone brave will fix it. Claire found purpose in her grief by becoming the hospital's first patient rights advocate. Her dual experience as a nurse and janitor gave her unique insight into the healthcare system's complexities. She often quoted Leo's final diary entry during her advocacy work. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest voices. Rebecca Wells established a scholarship program for medical students committed to ethical healthcare practices. Recipients were required to read Leo's diary and write about how they would implement his vision in their future practice. The program became highly competitive, with students nationwide competing to become Leo Thompson scholars. The physical transformation of St. Mary's reflected Leo's influence. The stark hospital corridors bloomed with artwork created by young patients. The once imposing administrative offices became open, welcoming spaces. Even the hospital's mission statement was rewritten to include a quote from Leo's diary: "Healing happens best when hearts and hands work together." Medical conferences began featuring sessions on the Leo Thompson approach to healthcare reform. His simple observations about inequality in treatment became a framework for identifying and addressing systemic problems. Healthcare professionals found that viewing their institutions through a child's eyes revealed problems they had learned to overlook. Perhaps the most lasting element of Leo's legacy was the annual Leo's Light Day, when hospitals nationwide opened their doors for community dialogue about healthcare access and equality. These events, marked by blue ribbons and candlelight vigils, kept his vision alive while pushing for continued reform. Claire and Daniel collaborated to establish the Leo Thompson Healthcare Justice Institute, dedicated to researching and addressing disparities in medical care. The institute's logo featured a simple drawing from Leo's diary, a hospital with open doors and a heart-shaped window under which he had written, "A place where everyone matters." As winter turned to spring, Leo's legacy continued to grow. His story touched people far beyond St. Mary's walls, inspiring changes in healthcare policies and practices across the country. His diary became more than a record of one child's observations; it became a blueprint for transformation. In the end, Leo Thompson's greatest legacy was hope that healthcare could become what he had imagined, hope that one small voice could inspire lasting change, and hope that future generations would never have to face the barriers he had encountered. His short life had planted seeds of change that would continue growing long after he was gone. The revelation that shook St. Mary's Foundation came 6 months after Leo's death. Claire was organizing his belongings when she discovered a false bottom in his diary, concealing a USB drive and a letter addressed to Mr. Richardson and Aunt Claire, "For when you're ready." The timing of the discovery coincided with the hospital's first major reform implementation, making its contents all the more powerful. The USB drive contained hundreds of audio recordings, conversations Leo had captured using a small device gifted by Amanda before her death. His mother had taught him the importance of documentation, and Leo had taken the lesson to heart. The recordings included board meetings conducted in his hospital room when they thought he was sleeping, late-night conversations between administrators discussing fund allocations, and countless interactions between staff and denied patients. But it was the letter that truly transformed everything. Written in Leo's careful handwriting, it revealed the full extent of his understanding. "Mom didn't just die from working too hard," he wrote. "She found out about the missing money and was going to tell everyone. I heard Mr. Wells talking about it when he thought I was asleep. That's why she had to work so many night shifts. They were punishing her." Daniel's hands shook as he listened to a recording of Thomas Wells discussing Amanda Thompson's death. "The night shift reassignment solved our problem," Wells could be heard saying. "No one questions when an overworked nurse makes a mistake." The revelation cast Amanda's fatal heart attack in a sinister new light. Claire's grief transformed into cold fury as she uncovered the truth about her sister's death. The excessive night shifts, the ignored complaints about understaffing, the mysterious disappearance of Amanda's documentation, it had all been orchestrated to silence a potential whistleblower. Leo had quietly collected evidence of it all, understanding more than anyone had realized. The recordings also revealed the true extent of Sarah Richardson's case. Not only had her treatment been denied to fund Wells's daughter's surgery, but Sarah had discovered the pattern of corruption and confronted the board. Her experimental treatment had been deliberately delayed until it was too late. Leo had captured a conversation confirming this, dated just weeks before his own diagnosis. Most heartbreaking were Leo's personal audio diaries, recorded late at night when the pain kept him awake. "I'm scared," his young voice confessed in one entry, "but Mom always said the truth is more important than fear. Maybe if I can prove what they did to her, they can't hurt anyone else." His courage in the face of such knowledge was staggering. The hidden evidence revealed that Leo had understood everything: the corruption, the deliberate delays in his treatment, the connection between his mother's death and Sarah Richardson's case. Yet instead of becoming bitter, he had chosen to document it all with the hope that the truth would eventually lead to change. Daniel and Claire found themselves facing a new dimension of grief and responsibility. The system hadn't just failed Leo, it had actively worked to silence those who tried to protect him and others like him. The corruption went deeper than anyone had imagined, reaching into the very foundations of the hospital's administration. The recordings included conversations about other whistleblowers who had been silenced, other patients who had died unnecessarily, other families who had been destroyed by the hospital's practices. Leo had captured it all, creating an irrefutable record of systematic corruption and intentional harm. His final recorded message, dated the night before his death, revealed the true purpose behind his documentation. "I'm not going to make it," he whispered, "but maybe my story can save others." Mr. Richardson needs to remember he was a doctor before he was a businessman. And Aunt Claire needs to know Mum didn't die for nothing. The truth always finds its way out, that's what Mum used to say. As Claire and Daniel listened to the evidence Leo had gathered, they realized that his death hadn't just been the result of delayed treatment, it had been the final act in a years-long pattern of silencing those who threatened to expose the truth. The child they had underestimated had become the most powerful witness against the system that had ultimately claimed his life. The hidden truth would change everything, not just for St. Mary's, but for healthcare institutions nationwide. Leo Thompson hadn't just been a victim of the system, he had been its most meticulous chronicler, ensuring that when the truth finally emerged, it would be impossible to ignore or deny. The revelation of Leo's hidden evidence triggered a transformation that rippled far beyond St. Mary's walls. Within hours of the recordings becoming public, Thomas Wells and several board members were led out of the hospital in handcuffs, their arrests covered live by national media. The sight of these once powerful figures being escorted through the lobby where Leo had collapsed became a powerful symbol of justice finally being served. The transformation began at the institutional level. Daniel Richardson, haunted by the truth about Sarah's death, initiated a complete restructuring of the hospital's governance. The new board included medical staff, patient advocates, and community representatives. Claire Thompson, elevated to chief patient advocate, ensured that every policy decision considered its human impact first. Dr. Matthews led the medical transformation, implementing what she called Leo's protocols guidelines, ensuring that treatment decisions were based solely on medical necessity, not financial status. The protocols included mandatory ethics reviews of denied treatments and transparent documentation of all care decisions. The changes spread to other hospitals as medical professionals recognized the need for systematic reform. The most profound transformation occurred in the hospital's culture. Staff members who had feared retaliation for reporting problems now spoke openly about concerns. The hierarchical barriers between administrators and caregivers dissolved as everyone recognized their shared responsibility to patients. Leo's practice of documenting everything became standard procedure, creating an unprecedented level of accountability. Claire's transformation from grieving aunt to powerful advocate inspired others. She established support networks for healthcare whistleblowers, ensuring that no one would face retaliation for exposing wrongdoing as Amanda had. Her program, Amanda's Legacy, provided legal protection and emotional support for those willing to stand up against corruption. Daniel underwent perhaps the most dramatic personal transformation. He surrendered his executive salary, choosing instead to return to practicing medicine in the pediatric ward. His office, once a symbol of corporate power, became a memorial space filled with children's artwork and stories of lives saved by the new policies. He often said that Leo had taught him more about healing than medical school ever had. The physical transformation of St. Mary's reflected its spiritual renewal. The imposing administrative wing was converted into a patient care center. Gardens sprouted where parking lots had been, fulfilling Leo's vision of healing spaces. The hospital's sterile corridors bloomed with color as patients and staff contributed to ongoing art projects celebrating life and healing. Rebecca Wells, transformed by guilt and determination, became an unexpected ally in healthcare reform. She traveled nationwide, sharing her perspective as someone who had benefited from corrupt practices, helping other institutions identify and address similar issues. Her testimony, combined with Leo's evidence, led to federal investigations of healthcare corruption across the country. The transformation reached beyond hospital walls into medical education. Leo's story became a case study in ethics courses, teaching future healthcare providers about the importance of moral courage. Medical schools revised their curricula to emphasize compassion and advocacy alongside technical skills, creating a new generation of physicians committed to equitable care. Even the local community transformed. People who had once accepted healthcare inequality as inevitable became active advocates for change. Weekly vigils outside St. Mary's evolved into regular community forums where patients, providers, and administrators worked together to improve care access and quality. The most beautiful transformation was in how Leo's legacy was honored. Rather than becoming a symbol of tragedy, his story inspired hope and action. The annual Leo Thompson Healthcare Justice Conference brought together medical professionals, advocates, and policymakers committed to continuing the transformation he had sparked. Claire found healing in witnessing these changes. Though nothing could fill the void left by Leo and Amanda, seeing their sacrifice lead to meaningful reform gave purpose to her grief. She often sat in the hospital garden, reading from Leo's diary to new staff members, ensuring that the lessons of the past shaped the future of care. Daniel, too, found redemption in the transformation. Each time he helped a family navigate the healthcare system, each time he saw a patient receive care that would have been denied under the old system, he felt a small measure of peace. He kept Leo's last recorded message on his phone, playing it whenever he needed reminding of why the transformation mattered. Sometimes the biggest changes start with admitting we were wrong and trying to make it right. As spring brought new life to the hospital gardens, the transformation of St. Mary's continued. The institution that had once prioritized profit over people had become a model of compassionate, equitable care. Leo's hidden truth had done more than expose corruption. It had catalyzed a fundamental reimagining of what healthcare could and should be. 1 year after Leo's death, St. Mary's Hospital hosted the first Leo Thompson Healthcare Justice Summit, drawing medical professionals, advocates, and policymakers from across the country. The event opened with Claire Thompson unveiling the hospital's new mission statement, words taken directly from Leo's diary: "Healthcare is not a privilege for the wealthy, but a right for all. Every life has equal value. Every story deserves to be heard." The summit marked the official launch of several initiatives born from Leo's legacy. The Leo Thompson Memorial Clinic, operating in what was once the hospital's executive wing, provided free care to underserved communities. The Amanda Thompson Whistleblower Protection Program offered support and legal aid to healthcare workers exposing corruption. The Sarah Richardson Medical Ethics Center trained doctors in compassionate, equitable care practices. Daniel Richardson, now serving as the clinic's lead physician, established a revolutionary patient advocacy system. Every person seeking care was assigned an advocate to help navigate treatment options, regardless of their ability to pay. The program, inspired by Leo's documentation of his own experience, ensured that no patient would face the system alone. The hospital's transformation became a blueprint for healthcare reform nationwide. Other institutions began adopting Leo's protocols, implementing transparent decision-making processes and ethical care guidelines. The movement grew beyond individual hospitals to influence healthcare policy at the state and federal levels. Claire's role evolved from patient advocate to national spokesperson for healthcare justice. She traveled across the country, sharing Leo's story and helping other hospitals implement similar reforms. Her testimony before Congress, reading excerpts from Leo's diary, led to new legislation protecting patient rights and whistleblowers. The new purpose brought unexpected allies. Rebecca Wells established a foundation supporting families facing medical crises, ensuring that no parent would have to choose between treatment and survival. Former board members who had opposed changes now became advocates for reform, their own transformations adding weight to the movement's momentum. Research programs flourished under the new mission. The hospital partnered with medical schools to study healthcare disparities and develop solutions. Leo's detailed documentation became a case study in how systemic corruption affects patient outcomes, leading to new approaches in medical administration and ethics. Community engagement became central to the hospital's operation. Regular town halls allowed local residents to participate in policy decisions. Patient stories, displayed alongside Leo's diary entries in the hospital's public spaces, reminded everyone of the human impact of healthcare policies. The physical transformation continued as well. The hospital grounds bloomed with healing gardens, art installations, and quiet spaces for reflection. The once stark corridors now featured murals painted by patients and staff, each telling a story of healing and hope. Leo's room became a sanctuary where families could find support and solidarity. Dr. Matthews developed a mentoring program pairing experienced healthcare providers with new medical students. The program emphasized both clinical skills and ethical decision-making, ensuring that future generations of medical professionals would prioritize patient care over profit. The hospital's financial model underwent radical change. Transparent accounting practices showed how funds were allocated, with priority given to patient care and community health programs. The Leo Thompson Foundation, supported by public donations and grants, ensured that no patient would be denied necessary treatment. Most significantly, the new purpose brought healing to those who had been part of the old system. Staff members who had witnessed years of corruption found redemption in helping build something better. Former administrators who had prioritized profit over care now taught others about the importance of ethical healthcare. Claire found her own healing in mentoring young advocates. She often shared Amanda's story alongside Leo's, showing how individual courage could spark systemic change. Her grief transformed into determination as she watched new generations take up the cause of healthcare justice. Daniel's return to practicing medicine reconnected him with his original calling. Each patient he treated reminded him of why he'd become a doctor in the first place. He kept a copy of Leo's diary in his white coat pocket, its pages worn from frequent reading, a constant reminder of the price of losing sight of medicine's true purpose. The new purpose extended beyond medicine to touch on fundamental questions of human dignity and social justice. St. Mary's became known not just as a hospital, but as a center for positive change in healthcare delivery and access. As the first anniversary of the summit approached, Claire found a final entry in Leo's diary that seemed to predict everything that had happened maybe someday. Hospitals won't be places where people are scared about money. They'll just be places where people help other people get better. That's what Mom always wanted. Maybe her dream can still come true. The new purpose had transformed St. Mary's from a symbol of healthcare inequality into a beacon of hope and change. Leo's legacy lived on not just in programs and protocols, but in every life touched by the reform system he had helped create. The final chapter of St. Mary's transformation began with justice. 2 years after Leo's death, in a packed courtroom, Thomas Wells and 6 former board members faced sentencing for criminal healthcare fraud, conspiracy, and in Amanda Thompson's case, negligent homicide. The evidence Leo had secretly gathered formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. The proceedings lasted weeks, with Claire and Daniel testifying about the systematic corruption they had witnessed. Rebecca Wells's testimony against her own father proved particularly devastating, describing how she had benefited from treatments denied to others. Former staff members came forward with their own stories, creating a comprehensive picture of how profit had been prioritized over human life. Leo's voice, preserved in recordings and diary entries, echoed through the courtroom. His simple, honest observations of hospital practices carried more weight than any expert testimony. Today they told another family they couldn't help their daughter, one entry read. "Mr. Wells says it's about resources, but his daughter got special treatment yesterday. I don't understand why some lives matter more than others." The sentencing judge, clearly moved by the evidence, delivered a landmark ruling. Wells and his co-conspirators received substantial prison terms, but more importantly, were ordered to forfeit all assets gained through their corruption. These funds would establish a trust for families who had been denied care, ensuring that some measure of restitution would be made. Daniel's own legal resolution came in the form of a plea agreement. In exchange for his cooperation and testimony, he received a suspended sentence and was allowed to continue practicing medicine. His public acknowledgement of complicity and subsequent efforts to reform the system were considered in his favor. Leo taught me that redemption begins with telling the truth, he told the court. The resolution extended beyond criminal justice. State healthcare authorities implemented new regulations based on the case, requiring transparent decision-making processes and independent oversight of hospital charitable funds. The Leo Thompson Healthcare Transparency Act became model legislation adopted by multiple states. Claire found her own resolution in establishing the Amanda Thompson Memorial Nursing Program, training healthcare workers to recognize and report systemic abuse. The program emphasized ethical practice alongside medical skills, ensuring that future generations of healthcare providers would have the courage to stand against corruption. St. Mary's itself underwent a final transformation. The hospital's governance structure was completely rebuilt, with a new board including medical professionals, patient advocates, and community representatives. Transparent financial practices and regular public audits became standard policy. The changes were codified in a new charter that began with words from Leo's diary: "A hospital should be a place where everyone matters equally." The resolution brought unexpected healing to many involved. Former board members who had cooperated with prosecutors found purpose in helping other institutions identify and address similar corruption. Staff members who had remained silent out of fear now led workshops on ethical healthcare practices. Even some of Wells's former allies became advocates for reform. Perhaps the most meaningful resolution came in the faces of families receiving care at the transformed St. Mary's. Children who would once have been turned away now received treatment without question. Parents who would have faced bankruptcy found support and assistance. The hospital's corridors, once filled with fear and desperation, now echoed with hope. Dr. Matthews, who had fought so hard to save Leo, found resolution in leading the hospital's new pediatric oncology center. Every child admitted received a copy of Leo's diary, not as a reminder of past failures, but as a promise of change. "We keep his story alive," she would say, "by making sure it never happens again." The resolution wasn't perfect. No justice could fully compensate for lost lives or heal all wounds. But as Claire stood in the hospital garden on the day of the sentencing, reading from Leo's diary to a group of medical students, she felt a sense of completion. The system that had failed her sister and nephew had been dismantled, replaced by something closer to what they had dreamed of. The true healing at St. Mary's began not with policy changes or legal victories, but with the quiet moments of human connection that Leo had written about in his diary. In the newly established Leo Thompson Memorial Garden, patients and staff gathered regularly to share stories, offering support and understanding to those still struggling with the healthcare system. Claire's healing manifested in her work with other families navigating medical crises. She transformed her grief into a powerful tool for change, using her experiences to help others avoid the pitfalls that had claimed Leo and Amanda. Her support groups, initially formed for families affected by healthcare corruption, evolved into communities of hope and mutual support. Daniel found his healing in returning to hands-on patient care. Each child he treated helped mend a piece of his broken faith in medicine. He kept his office door open, making himself available to anyone needing guidance or support. The white coat he now wore bore a small blue ribbon, reminding him daily of the price of losing sight of healthcare's true purpose. The hospital staff experienced collective healing through new practices that honored both patients and caregivers. Regular debriefing sessions allowed them to process difficult cases and share concerns openly. The fear and silence that had characterized the old St. Mary's gave way to transparency and mutual support. Dr. Matthews established healing circles where medical professionals could discuss the emotional toll of their work. These sessions, inspired by Leo's observations about doctors needing to remember their hearts, helped prevent the burnout and moral compromise that had once plagued the hospital. Rebecca Wells found unexpected healing in her advocacy work. Her foundation, supporting families facing medical crises, helped her process her own guilt over benefiting from corrupt practices. She often shared how Leo's story had forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege in healthcare. But the physical spaces of St. Mary's reflected this healing journey. Walls once adorned with corporate awards now displayed patient artwork and stories of recovery. The formerly sterile corridors bloomed with color and life, creating an environment that nurtured both body and spirit. Even former adversaries found paths to healing. Some board members who had initially resisted change became advocates for reform, their own transformations adding depth to the hospital's story of redemption. Their testimonies about the human cost of prioritizing profit over care helped other institutions recognize and address similar issues. The healing extended to the community around St. Mary's. Regular town halls allowed local residents to share their healthcare experiences and participate in shaping hospital policies. The walls between institution and community dissolved as people recognized their shared stake in creating a more equitable healthcare system. Medical students training at St. Mary's learned about healing that went beyond physical symptoms. Leo's diary became required reading, teaching them to see healthcare through the eyes of those most vulnerable. They learned to combine clinical expertise with compassion, understanding that true healing addresses both body and spirit. The annual Leo Thompson Day of Healing brought together all those touched by his story: patients, providers, advocates, and community members. The event combined medical education with storytelling, art therapy, and community building, embodying Leo's vision of a hospital as a place of comprehensive healing. Perhaps the most profound healing occurred in the relationship between Claire and Daniel. Their shared grief and purpose created a bond that transcended their former roles as adversaries. They often found themselves in Leo's garden late at night, sharing stories and supporting each other through difficult moments. The healing wasn't always easy or complete. Some wounds were too deep for perfect recovery, some losses too profound for full resolution. But as Claire noted in her journal, echoing Leo's words, healing doesn't mean forgetting or erasing the pain. It means finding purpose in it, using it to prevent others from suffering the same way. Through it all, Leo's presence continued to guide the healing process. His diary, with its simple wisdom and unfailing hope, reminded everyone that healing was both personal and collective, that each person's recovery contributed to the transformation of the entire system. The most profound revelation at St. Mary's came 3 years after Leo's death, discovered in a hidden compartment of his favorite book. It was a letter, written just days before he passed, addressed to the future. Inside was not just a message, but a complete blueprint for a children's hospital, unlike any other, drawn with the precise detail that only a child who had lived through the system could envision. The designs weren't just architectural sketches, they were a comprehensive vision of healthcare transformed. Leo had mapped out everything from patient-centered room layouts to garden spaces where families could heal together. Most surprisingly, he had included detailed notes about hospital policies, clearly influenced by conversations overheard during his long stays in the pediatric ward. What made the discovery particularly extraordinary was that many of the changes St. Mary's had implemented matched Leo's vision exactly, despite no one having seen these plans. The gardens he had drawn matched those planted in his memory. The patient advocacy program mirrored his written suggestions. Even the new transparency policies reflected his ideas about how hospitals should operate. Claire and Daniel were stunned to discover that what they had thought were their innovations had actually been Leo's dreams all along. The child they had tried to save had been quietly designing the very reforms they would later implement. His final gift wasn't just his evidence of corruption, but his vision of how healthcare could be transformed. The most startling element was a prediction written on the last page when you find this. St. Mary's will already be changing. Mom always said sometimes we have to lose something precious to remember what matters most. Maybe losing me will help everyone remember that hospitals are supposed to be places of hope, not fear. This final twist transformed Leo's legacy from one of tragedy to prophecy. His death hadn't just exposed corruption, it had set in motion exactly the changes he had envisioned. The child they had underestimated had been architect of his own memorial, designing not just a building but a revolution in healthcare. The discovery led to one final change at St. Mary's. Leo's detailed plans were adopted as the official blueprint for a new children's wing, incorporating every element he had designed. His artwork and notes were preserved as part of the building itself, reminding everyone that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from those we least expect. As Claire stood in the completed wing on opening day, she found one last note tucked into the original blueprints. Written in Leo's familiar handwriting, sometimes the biggest miracles don't look like what we expect. They look like people remembering how to care about each other again. The final twist wasn't just about a building or a program. It was the revelation that Leo had understood everything: the corruption, the need for change, and most importantly, how his own story could catalyze that transformation. He had orchestrated not just the exposure of wrongs, but the creation of something better. In the end, St. Mary's became exactly what Leo had envisioned, not just a hospital, but a testament to the power of seeing healthcare through the eyes of those it serves. His final gift wasn't just his evidence or his plans, but the reminder that sometimes the most profound changes come from the most unexpected sources. And so, in a final twist that no one could have predicted, the child they had failed to save became the architect of their redemption, teaching them that sometimes the greatest wisdom comes wrapped in the simplest packages. And that true healing begins when we learn to listen to those we've forgotten to hear. Dear, cherished viewers, your presence here means everything to us. If this story has touched your heart, please consider subscribing to our channel to support our team's dedication to bringing meaningful narratives to life. Every subscription fuels our passion to create more compelling content. Would you help us spread these messages of hope and change? Share this video with your loved ones, friends, and anyone who might need to hear this story. Your simple act of sharing could inspire someone else's journey toward healing and understanding. Your likes are more than just numbers to us, they're affirmations that these stories matter. They encourage us to keep exploring the depths of human experience and resilience. We'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings about Leo's story. How did it affect you? What moments resonated most deeply? Share your reflections in the comments below. Your perspectives enrich our community and help us understand what matters most to you. And speaking of what matters, would you be interested in hearing the next chapter of this journey? Let us know in the comments if you'd like to explore what happened next at St. Mary's Hospital and how Leo's legacy continued to transform lives. Together we can ensure that stories like these continue to be told, remembered, and shared. Thank you for being part of our storytelling family.